Hello friends, welcome back. Let us continue with the discussion of the metaphysical poetry. In the previous lecture uh, of the second topic of the first unit, part 1, we discussed about the introduction of the metaphysical poetry. The meaning of the terms meta and physics, and the combined meaning metaphysical means beyond the physical nature, right? Now, who gave the name means who first used these terms metaphysical? Dryden and Samuel Johnson, these two Augustan poets, they first used this term metaphysical for the first time. Then we talked about the uh, name of the poet who became the founder or the pioneer poet of metaphysical school of poetry. Means the group of metaphysical poets, they were led by John Donne, right? Why they are known as metaphysical? What is the thing that makes them metaphysical? That we also try to understand what it talks about. Metaphysical poetry talks about those subjects that are beyond this physical existence. Then we talked about conceits, which is extended metaphor that talks about the difference between the normal metaphor and the extended metaphor. Then we talked about several important poets who uh, talked about metaphysical poetry or who wrote metaphysical poetry along with John Donne. They were Herbert, Marvell, Crashaw, Cowley, Suckling, Henry Vaughan, etc. Now, in the discussion of this metaphysical poetry, let us see the uh, characteristics of metaphysical poetry. Now, which are the chief characteristics? Characteristics means features and a basic lakshana. Which are the basic features that distinguish this poetry from other kind of poetry, that is normal poetry or other than metaphysical poetry. Now let us see one by one. The first thing, the first feature is this kind of poetry is very complex. Obviously, looking at the outer appearance or the things that we have discussed so far about the subject of this poetry, we can say that it is very complex. Most varied concepts are brought together. Most varied concepts, varied means of different kinds, concepts are brought together. Means in the discussion of this kind of poetry, varied subjects are being discussed simultaneously in one poem. So it is complex, it becomes complex. It is difficult for the ordinary reader to understand. So, being its complex nature and the combination of varied concepts brought together, it becomes more and more complex, which is comparatively very difficult to understand for a common reader. Second thing is, it is intellectual in tone. Now, these spiritual, religious, philosophical, all such subjects are to be understood very intellectually, because the discussion of these subjects are the intellectual subjects. So, it is in tone, intellectual one. There is an analysis of the most delicate shades of psychological experiences. Now, when it is the discussion of intellectual ideas, spiritual subjects, we have to, or one has to perceive it psychologically, because the experiences are shared in this kind of poetry, they are psychological experiences, and that is why it is to be understood psychologically. So the analysis of the most delicate shades of psychological experiences means whatever the poet has experienced in his psyche, he narrates it into his poem, and when the reader tries to read or understand that poem, he must go up to that level of the poet. Then only he can understand the shades. Shades means the difference between the terminology or the words or the experiences or the thoughts that are given by the poet. Number 3, there is a fusion of emotion and intellect. Now, fusion may be a term that you might be knowing. Fusion means mixing, combination of two things, that is emotion and intellect. Emotions means the feelings that a human being is experiencing, and that is intellect. Now, intellect means in Gujarati we call it buddhi, reason, logic. Emotion and intellect. Emotions are analyzed in intellectual manner. Now, this is very important for metaphysical poetry, because these two things are comparatively far-fetched. They are brought together from different levels of understanding. Emotions are related to the heart of a human being, means one feels emotions from his heart, and intellect is related to the mind. So these two faculties that are within the human being, but they have uh, separate identity. So emotions and intellect, they normally do not go side by side, but here in metaphysical poetry they are combined together, they are discussed together, they are brought together, and that is why it becomes a complex subject to be understood normally by ordinary readers. So to understand this kind of poetry, one requires a special understanding power or intellectual power, psychological understanding level, that may help him to perceive the meaning of the metaphysical poetry. Number 4, it is full of conceits. Again, we mentioned this, that it is full of conceits, mean this kind of comparison is given everywhere. A conceit means juxtaposition of opposite ideas and images. Now, conceit can be explained in these terms also. Juxtaposition means parallel positioning. Parallel positioning means presenting two things simultaneously at the same time, means parallel presentation of opposite ideas and images. Opposite ideas means ideas that are not of the same branch, same level, same understanding. They are opposite in level, in understanding, and that is why it becomes complex, it becomes difficult. So juxtaposition of opposite ideas and images, that is the meaning of the term conceits here. Number 5 is, it is argumentative. Argumentative means here psychological presentation is there, and when psychological presentation is there, it is argumentative, means there are arguments, there are logical arguments to prove some idea or thought. The poet advances his arguments like a lawyer. Arguments, in Gujarati we have a word dalil karvi, as we find the lawyers making arguments to prove their case, to justify their case, to justify the logic that they are believing in or that they are putting forth. So, just like a lawyer, the poet, the metaphysical poet, is making the arguments to justify the image, justify the idea, or justify the thought that he is talking about. The subjects are religious, spiritual, philosophical, theological, all such subjects which require the discussion of logical arguments and to prove the logicality of the subject. And so that is why uh, the poet has to prove his ideas with the logical arguments. So it is argumentative, means the poetry, the narration of the poetry is argumentative. Argumentative means giving the arguments in support of the logic that they have to say, or they have to put forth. The next thing, number 6, is the poet uses a new vocabulary drawn from the different fields such as trade and commerce, arts and sciences. Now, uh, in normal poetry, in a sonnet or a lyric, we don't find the references or the terminology or the words used from the trade and commerce or science faculty or science field. So all such kind of terminology are being used by metaphysical poets from all such fields. Subjects as well as the words are being used to make the comparison, make the use of conceit. Such words are being brought into the narration of the poetry to make the metaphor, to use metaphor to explain the idea, and that is why this discussion or narration of the poetry gives a complex vision difficult to understand for the common reader. So the poet uses a new vocabulary, drawn means brought from the different fields such as trade and commerce. Trade means vyapar, and commerce means business, and arts and sciences. So science faculty, the terminology or images are brought from that field that is not a branch of literature, and that is why it becomes complex. The next feature is there are unusual rhymes, strange rhythms, and composed words. The figures of speech are often excessive. Now, in the narration of the metaphysical poetry, we find unusual rhymes. Rhymes એટલે ગુજરાતીમાં આપણે કહીએ છીએ પ્રાસ, શબ્દોનો અથવા વર્ણનો પ્રાસ જે કવિતામાં જોવા મળે એ અહીંયા તમને અનયુઝ્યુઅલ મળે છે. The rhyme is unusual and the rhythm is strange. Rhythm એટલે એનો સુર, લય, that is strange. It is not normal or natural that you find in any other poetry such as sonnet or lyric poetry. So rhyme and rhythm, both these things you find here strange and unusual. Along with that, we find composed words. Composed words means words are that are created, composed from two different words or three different words combined together and made a new term, that are composed words. So such words are never known to the readers, and that is why it becomes difficult for them to understand. One more thing to add to that, that is the figures of speech are often excessive. Excessive means in too many numbers. Excessive means more use of figures of speech are used to make this complex presentation of metaphysical subjects. So metaphysical poetry becomes complex, it becomes difficult to understand because of these reasons, that they have unusual rhymes, strange rhythms, and the words used are the composed words composed by the author, means the poet himself, and that is why it becomes difficult for the reader. And the eighth feature is it is often dramatic in form. It is often dramatic, means poetry is the genre, but it has the presentation or the narration in a dramatic form. So the form of this poetry is often dramatic, not always but often. Such poetry presents a drama of ideas. Drama of ideas means the ideas are presented dramatically to make a very good presentation to be understood very easily by the readers. The effort is very mature, but it becomes complex because of all such characteristics that we find in the presentation of this subject. Then let us see the subject matter of the poetry. Subject matter means the in Gujarati we have the word Vishay Vastu. What are the subjects that are being dealt with in this poetry, this metaphysical poetry? Metaphysical poetry written on this subject of love, but the treatment of the subject was quite different. Now, the thing that we need to concentrate upon is the subject of this poetry is again love only. Love is there. Love is the subject that is being discussed by many poets in many kind of poetry. In lyric also we find love. In sonnets also we have love. In ballads and odes also we have the subject of love. But the in the metaphysical poetry, which is written on the subject of love, but it becomes difficult for the readers to understand because of the treatment of the subject is quite different. Instead of logical element, we find more intellectual elements in the treatment of love. Now the treatment of love means the subject of love, love between two human beings, a man and a woman's love, a man and a man's love, man and nature's love, man and animals love, man and God's love. All such subjects related to love are being discussed with uh, intellectual elements, means instead of logical elements we find intellectual elements in the treatment of love, and that becomes the complex thing that makes the metaphysical poetry difficult to understand. It connects the abstract with the concrete. Now, the subject matter of metaphysical poetry has this special feature that it connects abstract with the concrete. Abstract means those things or those ideas, those subjects which do not exist on the physical level on this earth. So they are known as abstract ideas. Abstract means in Gujarati we have the word amurt, જેની મૂર્તિ નથી. મૂર્તિ એટલે અસ્તિત્વ, જેનો આકાર આપણી સામે દેખાતો નથી તેવા આઈડિયાઝ છે, એવા વિચારો છે. Those abstract ideas are connected with concrete things. Concrete means physically existent, means those things that we find physically present on the earth. So these two things are brought together, means it is juxtaposed, presented parallelly. So abstract with concrete. Then the remote with the near. Remote with the near means remote means what is existing very far, that is remote, and near means very near to us. So far and near these two things are brought together. Normally a comparison is made between two nearer things or two far things, but here one thing is near and another thing is remote. So remote and near, these two things are again juxtaposed. And physical with the spiritual. Physical with the spiritual. Physical means what is physical? ભૌતિક સ્વરૂપે જે અસ્તિત્વ ધરાવે છે તે, that is known as physical, right? And spiritual means આધ્યાત્મિક, કે જે અમૂર્ત છે, જેના વિચારો વિશે આપણે માત્ર વાત કરીએ છીએ પણ એની કોઈ ચોક્કસ આકૃતિ આપણી સામે નથી. That is spiritual. Religious, philosophical, because they talk about the life and death. Life is not existing thing that we find physically on the earth. We don't know about death, birth, what happens after death. These are the things that are spiritual, that we do not understand. So here physical with the spiritual connection we find, and the sublime with the commonplace. And one more comparison, it is sublime and commonplace. Sublime means of the best quality, of the highest degree, that is called sublime. Sublime means in Gujarati we have the word utkrusht, ekdam best quality nu, adbhut. And commonplace means ordinary. So this juxtaposition of sublime with commonplace, now this is also a rare thing to be found in other poetry, which we find in metaphysical poetry. So the subject matter of the metaphysical poetry is quite different from other sorts of poetry that is not metaphysical. They are the comparisons are abstract with the concrete, remote with the near, physical with the spiritual, and sublime with the commonplace. So these are the contradictions we find in poetry, that in the metaphysical poetry discussion. So presenting two contradictory aspects at the same time, this is the special feature of the subject matter of the metaphysical poetry. The thoughts of the metaphysical poets were often new but seldom natural. The thoughts presented in metaphysical poetry by the metaphysical poets, they were often new, means the new thoughts are being presented, but seldom natural. But they are seldom means rarely they are natural. Natural means સ્વાભાવિક, સહજ રીતે આપણે જેને સમજી અને સ્વીકારી શકીએ તેવા ભાગ્યે જ હોય છે. Now this is something which is not found normally in common poetry. The thoughts are new. New thoughts must be presented by the original writer, and that is the requirement of any literary writer. But the thoughts must be natural, but here they are seldom natural, means they are unnatural comparisons, unnatural bringing in new terms, and that is why they becomes complex to be understood. The thoughts of the metaphysical poets were often new, but they are seldom natural. They introduced far-fetched images which could not be easily understood by the reader. Far-fetched. Far-fetched means fantastic or unbelievable. Far-fetched means અગોચર. ગુજરાતીમાં સરસ શબ્દ છે કે જે બ્રહ્માંડના એવા અગોચર વિષયો વિશેની વાત એમાં કરેલી હોય કે જે સામાન્ય માણસના, સામાન્ય વાચકના સમજમાં બેસે નહીં. And that is why it becomes more and more complex. So the introduction of images that are far-fetched એટલે બહુ દૂર દૂરના સંદર્ભોથી ખેંચીને લાવેલી હોય તેવી ફેન્ટાસ્ટિક એને બીજા શબ્દોમાં કહીએ, or that is unbelievable. We cannot believe it. So the introduction of far-fetched images used by the writer, the poet, it is known as far-fetched images, and they are very difficult to understand by the reader. Then most of the metaphysical poets are often called mystical poets. Now, most of the metaphysical poets, the names that we took, Vaughan, Donne, Marvell, Cowley, Creshaw, most of all these metaphysical poets, they are mystic poets. They are called mystic poets. Mystic means spiritual or supernatural, means they are talking about the subjects that are related to spirituality, religion, philosophy, all such subjects they are discussing in their poetry, and that is why they are known as mystical poets. Mystical, the Gujarati term for this mystical word, that is good or રહસ્યવાદી, જેને આપણે સરળતાથી ન સમજી શકીએ તે પ્રકારના વિષયોની ચર્ચા તમને આ કવિતામાં જોવા મળે. In their poetry, there is an expression of a communion with God. Communion means spiritual union. Spiritual union means the soul's union with God, means the discussion of birth, life and death. Man's soul, we all have our soul within us, and this soul is a part of the eternal soul, means the soul of the God, means we are all the children of God, we say that, or the poets or the religious personalities say that we are all the children of God, means we are all a part of the eternal soul. Eternal soul means the Almighty God. So we are all the part of the eternal soul, and that is why we are all brethren. We are all brethren means we are all brothers of the single parent, means the God. So all these subjects in the metaphysical poetry are related to the discussion of the communion with God. Communion means the union with God. Man gets birth as a soul from the God, and ultimately after his life he again merges his soul with the God. માણસ ઈશ્વરના આત્મામાંથી છૂટો પડીને પોતાનો આત્મા ધારણ કરી અને અવતાર પામે છે, અને આખું જીવન જીવ્યા બાદ ફરી પાછો એ આત્મા ઈશ્વરના આત્મા સાથે ભળી જાય છે. આ પ્રક્રિયાને કમ્યુનિયન વિથ ગોડ એમ કહી શકાય. સો the discussion of these topics or these subjects of taking birth, living life and ultimately communion with God. So this is spiritual, and that is why it is mystical, metaphysical, supernatural, and that is beyond the understanding of common human being, and that is why it is known as complex subject or difficult subject to understand. These mystic poets have sense of unity of all life. These mystic poets means most of the metaphysical poets, they are mystical poets, and they talk about the unity of all life, means life of from the birth to the death. The entire life is being discussed by these poets. They believe that the spiritual is alone the real world, and that the things of this world are mere shadows. Now This is also a philosophical understanding that we normally talk, that the spiritual is alone the real world. These philosophical people, these metaphysical poets, and our religious sages, all those people say that spiritual એટલે કે આધ્યાત્મિક જે છે તે જ માત્ર સાચું વિશ્વ છે. આધ્યાત્મિક વિશ્વ એ જ સાચું વિશ્વ છે. The spiritual world is alone the real world, and that the things on this world, આ દુનિયા પર જે તમને વસ્તુઓ દેખાય છે તે બધી આર મિયર શેડોઝ, એ બધા જ માત્ર શેડોઝ છે. શેડોઝ મીન્સ પ્રતિબિંબ અથવા પડછાયા છે. સો ધ રિયલ થિંગ ઇઝ spirituality, and the physical things that we have on this earth, they are mere shadows. They are simply the shades. Shadow એટલે પડછાયો. So these are the things that we do not, or rather never try to understand, and that is why we cannot understand. So these metaphysical poets believe that the spiritual is alone the real world, and the things on this earth are mere shadows. According to C.S. Lewis, metaphysics in poetry is the fruit of the Renaissance tree becoming overripe and approaching putrescence. Now, a philosopher as well as a poet, he writes, his name is C.S. Lewis. He says very good about the identity of metaphysical poetry. He says it is the fruit of the Renaissance tree, means after the emergence of Renaissance, after the effects of Renaissance, the Elizabethan poetry grew in plenty with full swing, and this presentation of the subject of love and the related subjects in the Renaissance poetry, this poetry was overripened in the hands of metaphysical poets. So metaphysical poetry is the fruit of Renaissance tree becoming overripe, means too much understanding of the Renaissance spirit we find in metaphysical poetry, and this overripened state of poetry that goes to putrescence. Putrescence means spoilage or rotting or the decay. Decay means સડી જવું. જેમાંથી કોઈ ફ્રૂટ છે એ વધુ પાકી જાય ત્યારે એમાંથી જે બગાડની સ્મેલ આવે એ પ્રકારની અસર તમને અહીં જોવા મળે છે, આવું C.S. લ્યુઇસનું કહેવું છે. He says that metaphysics in poetry is the fruit of the Renaissance tree becoming overripe. Overripe means વધુ પડતું પાકી જવું તે. Ripe means પાકી જવું. Overripe and approaching putrescence means approaching the spoilage. Fruit, when it becomes overripe, it becomes spoiled. It is rotten fruit, and that is not to be accepted, not to be understood easily. So these are the subject matters of the metaphysical poetry that we normally have. Now let us stop here, and in the next lecture we shall discuss about the important metaphysical poets, their life and works. Okay, so let us stop here.